It is May 27th, 2023. A heavy silence hangs over this quiet Maryland suburb. A neighbor notices a thick pillar of black smoke rising from the brush behind a nearby residence and alerts the authorities. First responders arrive to find the embers cooling, but the source of the fire remains a mystery with no suspects in sight. They are unaware that 4 days prior, this unassuming house was the stage for a sequence of events straight from a nightmare. A local woman was allegedly murdered and dismantled by her own daughter and granddaughter. It is a discovery that leaves the community paralyzed with fear. The victim was dismembered into more than 67 individual pieces. This is 19-year-old Celia Hardy, who claims her grandmother's screams were simply a part of daily life. She explains that the elderly woman would scream whenever she suffered a fall, but investigators have found remains. The detective asks if she understands the term dismembered, explaining they found human remains packed into bags. He admits he cannot confirm the identity yet, though Celia knows no one else should be in that home. 71-year-old Margaret Craig has not been seen by anyone for days. As the police dig deeper, they realize this missing person case is spiraling into something far more sinister. Family members report she vanished twice last year and again in January of this year. She had returned after 3 days during previous episodes, refusing to disclose where she had been. A grandmother's final cry, a smoking backyard grill, and a chainsaw purchased on Amazon. We present the harrowing investigation into the disappearance of Margaret Craig, featuring exclusive interview footage. Known to her loved ones as Auntie Joyce, she was a pillar of her extended family. As her health declined following several strokes, she required constant, dedicated care. Her primary caregiver was her 44-year-old daughter, Candace, who lived with her around the clock. To the outside world, Candace appeared to be the devoted daughter attending to her mother's every need. One would expect her to be frantic with worry over her mother's absence, yet her reaction was strangely muted. On May 31st, a concerned nephew drives to the residence after a week of unanswered calls. Given her fragile medical history, the family fears the worst has finally happened. When the door remains shut, he contacts the police and sends a frantic message to Candace. He warns her that the police are conducting a welfare check, apologizing for the alarm but insisting something is wrong. Candace offers nothing but a simple thumbs-up emoji in response. When she eventually speaks to the family, she claims Margaret simply left to visit a friend's house. She insists on waiting 72 hours before involving the law, a tactic that initially works. The responding officer departs, seeing no immediate cause for intervention regarding the vulnerable adult. But the intuition of the family remains sharp, and 2 days later, on June 2nd, they dial 911 again. A concerned relative contacts the department, pleading for a second, more thorough welfare check on the property. At precisely 1:37 in the afternoon, officers return to the quiet address on Margaret Craig Street. Candace opens the door with an air of indifference, acting as though the police presence is a mere inconvenience. She maintains her story that the 72-hour window has not yet closed since her mother allegedly departed. However, the moment the officers step across the threshold, their investigation takes a sickening and irreversible turn. Detectives separate the mother and daughter, ushering Candace and Celia into individual rooms for questioning. They demand a precise timeline of the last moments Margaret was seen in her state of mind before she vanished. Candace appears to be in physical distress, shifting in her seat as if burdened by a recent and severe injury. She mentions a recurring back issue and a visit to the emergency room nearly 1 month prior to this day. Investigators watch her closely, wondering if a recent bout of heavy lifting has triggered her visible agony. Public scrutiny is intensifying, and the detectives need to see if the daughter's testimony mirrors that of her mother. The investigator begins the formal process, asking the 19-year-old for her full legal name. She identifies herself as Celia Hardy and lists the residents of the household, including her mother's boyfriend. The detective asks how long she has resided in the home with her grandmother and mother. She replies that it has been 2 years since she moved into the residence. The atmosphere in the room shifts as the investigator asks when she last saw her grandmother alive. Celia claims she last saw her on Tuesday morning, just before she left the house to head to her job. She specifies the time was approximately 11:30 in the morning when she went to check on her. The detective asks if Margaret seemed healthy or if anything appeared out of the ordinary at that time. Celia states her grandmother was simply resting in her bedroom during those late morning hours. She explains that her check was routine, and she assumed her grandmother was just catching up on sleep. The investigator then pivots to the mother, asking for her version of the events surrounding the disappearance. Candace claims Celia saw Margaret on Tuesday, supposedly while the grandmother was emptying a medical bag. She describes a scene where the grandmother walked out of her room and supposedly exited through the front door. Candace suggests that her daughter heard the door open and assumed the elderly woman had decided to leave. She dates this supposed sighting as Tuesday, May 30th, just before the work shift began. At this point, the narratives seem to align, with both women placing the grandmother in the house 3 days ago. The detective then asks Candace when she personally last interacted with her mother. Candace claims they were grilling food on Monday, and she took a plate of hamburgers and chicken to her mother's room. She recalls a quiet evening where the only activity was delivering a meal of burgers and chicken to the bedroom. The investigator asks about Margaret's physical state, and Candace lists a history of strokes and diabetes. She adds that her mother showed signs of early dementia, though it was never formally diagnosed by a physician. As Candace speaks, her hands drift to her neck and back again, a subconscious display of intense physical discomfort. This body language is a red flag for the seasoned detective, suggesting she is carrying a weight she cannot hide. The mention of undiagnosed dementia provides a convenient explanation for why the elderly woman might wander off. The detective probes into Margaret's personal life, asking if there were any hidden conflicts within the household. Candace admits to general issues and a sense of depression lingering over her mother's final days. Meanwhile, in the other room, Celia's focus shifts away from medical history toward the emotional tension. She describes her grandmother as being unusually withdrawn and silent throughout the preceding Monday. According to Celia, Margaret had spent the entire day confined to her room, barely moving or speaking. She notes that for the last 48 hours, the house was unnervingly quiet, a departure from their normal routine. Celia recalls hearing her grandmother crying on the phone, describing a woman who seemed deeply depressed. She claims she urged her grandmother to speak to other family members, but the elderly woman refused. The detective notes that Margaret did not drive, making her sudden disappearance on foot even more suspicious. He asks Celia where she believes her grandmother could have gone without a vehicle or assistance. Celia professes total ignorance, noting her mother's spinal injury prevented them from driving much in May. She mentions that while Margaret usually called her brother-in-law for rides, no such call was made that day. She adds that her father was unconcerned, dismissing the disappearance as her grandmother simply being with a man. Candace is now attempting to mask her own lack of alarm, presenting a front of calm resignation to the police. But in the adjacent room, Celia is inadvertently dismantling her mother's carefully constructed narrative. The investigator asks if it is normal to go 4 days without seeing a grandmother who lives in the same house. Celia admits that it is absolutely not normal, despite her mother's claims that this has happened before. She reveals that under normal circumstances, she would see Margaret every single day before or after work. She clarifies that her grandmother was usually a constant presence, not a recluse hidden in her room. When asked where her mother claimed Margaret went, Celia reveals a startling lack of detail. She states that her mother never mentioned a friend's house or any specific destination to her. The detective asks who actually initiated the missing persons report if the family was so hesitant. Celia mentions the 2 previous times her grandmother vanished, though no official police reports exist for them. She claims Margaret would always return by the 3rd day, silent and refusing to explain her whereabouts. Celia explains that the 3rd day was usually the limit, but she remains unsure who contacted the authorities today. She recalls that a cousin called the police on Wednesday, leading to an initial visit that yielded no results. During that first visit, Candace convinced officers that her mother had a habit of wandering off for 72 hours. Celia explains that her mother planned to file a formal report today, only because that self-imposed deadline had passed. The investigator shifts the focus to digital evidence, asking when she last communicated with her grandmother by phone. Celia recalls a text message on Monday asking her to come downstairs to open a bottle of water. She notes that Margaret rarely responded to outgoing texts, preferring to communicate through more direct means. If she needed assistance, the grandmother would typically bang on the wall or call out from the stairs. The detective realizes that while Candace's story relies on anecdotes, a text message leaves a forensic trail. They can verify if a message originated from Margaret's device on Monday, May 29th, but not who typed it. The investigator asks for a detailed account of how the mother and daughter ended up at the station today. Celia describes being in the basement earlier that afternoon, assisting her mother with a messy cleanup task. She claims they were cleaning up after the youngest child when a sudden knock at the door interrupted them. An officer arrived to report a missing persons claim and requested to conduct a visual sweep of the premises. The police then secured the house, preventing anyone from entering or leaving while the search intensified. Celia recalls the officer, explaining that they simply needed to ask a few questions regarding the last sighting of Margaret. The detective tries to understand why a disabled 71-year-old would leave without her essential belongings. He points out that while she had vanished before, 5 days is an unprecedented amount of time for her to be gone. Celia agrees that the duration is strange, but admits she was holding on to the hope that Margaret would just pop up. She repeats her mother's narrative, stating they planned to wait exactly 72 hours before taking action. The investigation then moves toward financial motives, inquiring about access to the grandmother's bank accounts. The detective asks if there have been any unusual transactions or credit card activity in the last 5 days. Candace claims there have been no transactions because her mother cannot remember her own passwords. She points out that the notebook containing all of Margaret's sensitive passwords was left behind on the bed. When asked about the specific bank, Candace identifies the account as being with Capital One. She admits to making recent transactions herself, but insists her mother has not touched the account. It becomes increasingly evident that Candace is the gatekeeper to every aspect of Margaret's life. As the sole caregiver for her mother, Candace had total control over the finances and the flow of information. If Margaret had truly vanished, Candace was the only person with the means to track her digital footprint. Throughout the interrogation, Candace continues to paint a bleak picture of her mother's deteriorating mental health. Candace insists that she was the only one Margaret could rely on, the person she called for everything. She describes their relationship as close, despite her mother's disappointment in her past career choices. She explains that while they had their differences, she remained the primary contact for all of Margaret's needs. Candace suggests that her mother wanted her to pursue higher education, creating a lingering sense of unfulfillment. She portrays herself as the martyr, the one who sacrificed everything to be there every time her mother called. In the other room, the detective asks Celia to describe the dynamic between her mother and grandmother. Celia's tone shifts as she reveals a much darker reality, describing the relationship as deeply fractured. She mentions rumors within the family that Candace had been systematically stealing money from Margaret. When asked if her mother is currently employed, Celia confirms that Candace has been jobless for a long time. According to Celia, her mother has not held a steady job for at least 10 years. She expresses confusion over how her mother obtains money, despite Candace claiming to receive paychecks. Celia confirms that this financial tension was a constant source of friction within the household for over 2 years. The detective probes further, asking if Candace ever became physically violent during these financial disputes. Celia denies seeing direct physical violence, claiming she never heard her mother yelling at her grandmother. However, she admits that Margaret would frequently call out her name, which would visibly irritate Candace. She describes how her mother would grow frustrated with the constant demands of the elderly woman. The investigator realizes they are no longer just looking for a missing person, but exploring a motive for murder. He asks about the possibility of violence again, suspecting the tension may have reached a breaking point. The detective points out that it is abnormal for a caregiver not to be concerned after 5 days of silence. He challenges Candace on her 72-hour rule, noting that daily communication was their established norm. Candace doubles down, insisting her concern would only truly kick in after that arbitrary 3-day window. At that moment, the detective reveals that investigators are currently back at the family home. He informs her that they have obtained a court-ordered search warrant to go through every inch of the house. Candace's reaction is immediate. Her face pales and her composure begins to fracture. She appears shaken to her core, her eyes darting around the room as the weight of the situation sinks in. The detective knows why she is terrified, because the search team has already made a gruesome discovery. He leans in and tells her plainly that they have found a dismembered body inside the residence. He explains the term dismembered to her, detailing how they found human remains packed into plastic bags. He describes the state of the remains, explaining that someone's body had been systematically chopped up. The detective admits he cannot yet prove the identity, but the implication hangs heavy in the air. He acknowledges that, since everyone claims she is missing, it is logical to assume the remains belong to her. The detective reveals his identity as a homicide investigator, shifting the tone to a formal murder inquiry. He asks if the situation at home ever escalated to a point of extreme physical confrontation. He explains that finding human remains packed into black bags in the house is a definitive sign of foul play. The narrative flashes back to earlier that afternoon when officers first arrived for the welfare check. It was just after the lunch hour, and they expected nothing more than a routine visit to a quiet residence. They believed any trail would lead them away from the property, but the truth was buried within the walls. The moment Candace allowed them inside, a foul and unmistakable odor hit the officers. It was the heavy, cloying scent of organic decay, a smell that no amount of cleaning could fully mask. In the basement, they discovered 3 white plastic trash bags sitting directly on the floor. Dark, brownish stains were visible on the concrete surrounding the bags, suggesting a leak. One of the bags was partially open, revealing what appeared to be human brain matter to the horrified officers. A blood-stained knife lay on the floor nearby, a silent witness to the brutality that had occurred. Candace Craig had effectively invited the police into the center of a horrific crime scene. During the search, they also located a chainsaw cover, various cutting tools, and a surplus of cleaning supplies. Finally, they found the chainsaw itself, hidden away but still bearing traces of its recent use. It required very little imagination to understand the grisly purpose that chainsaw had served in this house. A neighbor watched from across the street as the police began cordoning off the area with yellow tape. They recalled seeing a small table with an umbrella and a grill set up in the backyard recently. In retrospect, they realized the smoke they had seen was not from a typical family barbecue. Realizing Candace is unlikely to confess, investigators pivot to the younger and more vulnerable Celia. The detective tells Celia that while he cannot confirm the identity, the remains in the basement speak for themselves. He asks her directly who else would be found in such a condition within their own home. The sudden revelation that the police know everything causes Celia's facade to crumble instantly. Faced with the undeniable evidence of the remains, she begins to offer the truth for the first time. She urges the detective to ask anything, her voice trembling as the weight of the secret breaks her. Celia admits that she heard her grandmother's final scream on that fateful Monday evening. She explains that the scream was harrowing, though she tried to convince herself it was just another fall. Her grandmother had a history of vocalizing when she was in pain, which provided a temporary cover for the crime. She asked her mother about the noise, and Candace claimed the boyfriend had simply knocked something over. Celia recalls her mother entering the room shortly after the scream to reassure her that nothing was wrong. Candace insisted that Benny had simply caused a loud disturbance in the basement, a common occurrence. She tells the investigator that she was already awake in her room when the chilling sound echoed through the house. Celia admits that she didn't investigate further because her grandmother often screamed during accidental falls. The detective leans in, sensing that the girl's resistance is fading as the reality of the situation sets in. He offers her a drink or a snack, a psychological tactic used to build rapport and encourage further confession. He asks if she has any allergies, maintaining a calm and caring demeanor to keep her talking. The investigator leaves the room for a moment, letting the heavy silence of the station work on Celia's conscience. Celia sits alone, her body language shifting to a state of profound self-soothing and isolation. She hugs herself tightly, as if trying to hold her fracturing world together within the four gray walls. Her eyes drift to the metal cuffs attached to the interrogation table, a grim reminder of her potential future. She appears resigned to her fate, understanding that her only path forward is through total cooperation. When the detective returns, Celia takes a fruit cup, her movements slow and mechanical like someone in a trance. She is now prepared to turn on her own mother to save what remains of her own life. The investigator asks her to clarify the timeline of Monday night versus her earlier claim of seeing Margaret on Tuesday. He asks if she is certain she saw her grandmother alive on Tuesday morning, or if it was just a memory of a sound. Celia falters, admitting she only heard a noise she assumed was snoring coming from the darkened bedroom. She confesses that she never actually saw Margaret's face or spoke to her at all on that Tuesday morning. The detective points out that Margaret could very well have been dead while Celia was standing outside the door. Celia's previous statement, the one her mother's entire alibi relied upon, is now completely dismantled. The detective speaks of the tragedy of such a violent end, contrasting it with a natural death from old age. He emphasizes the lack of dignity in being chopped up and hidden in bags like household refuse. He explains that they are trying to understand the depth of the suffering that occurred within those walls. He mentions the unmistakable smell of death that filled the house, a scent that lingers in the memory of the officers. Forensic evidence suggests that the body had been decomposing for at least 3 to 4 days before discovery. This scientific timeline matches perfectly with the scream Celia heard on Monday night. By the time Friday arrived, the process of decay had made the crime impossible to hide any longer. The investigator tells her that even the smallest detail, things she might think are trivial, could be vital now. Celia suddenly mentions her mother's Amazon order history, something she had seen on the family computer. She reveals that she saw an order for a chainsaw placed earlier that very week. The investigator's eyes widen as Celia confirms that the chainsaw was delivered just 2 days after the scream. She admits that her mother didn't just buy it. She asked Celia to help her use it in the basement. Celia describes a scene of absolute horror, where her mother was struggling to finish the gruesome task alone. She claims she was coerced into assisting, her mother's voice cold and commanding as she gave instructions. They spent hours in the subterranean darkness, the mechanical roar of the saw muffled by the foundation. Celia details how they placed the remains into the backyard grill, attempting to incinerate the evidence of their crime. The smoke that the neighbors had seen was the literal ash of Margaret Craig, rising into the Maryland sky. She explains that when the grill proved inefficient, they moved the remaining parts back into the basement. The white and black bags found by police were the final storage solution for what they could not burn. The detective asks why she didn't run to the neighbors or call 911 the moment she saw the saw. Celia weeps, claiming she was terrified of her mother and felt there was no way out of the nightmare. She describes her mother as a different person in those moments, someone possessed by a cold, clinical detachment. The investigator shifts back to Candace's room, where she is still maintaining a wall of total denial. He tells Candace that her daughter has already started talking, and the story she is telling is devastating. Candace's expression doesn't change, but her breathing becomes shallow and jagged as she stares at the wall. The detective mentions the Amazon order, the chainsaw, and the blood-stained knife found near the bags. He explains that they have enough evidence to charge both of them with first-degree murder and disposal of a body. Candace finally speaks, her voice a low rasp, asking if she can see her daughter one last time. The request is denied. They are now co-defendants in one of the state's most high-profile matricide cases. Outside the station, news crews begin to gather, their camera lights cutting through the heavy midnight fog. Reporters whisper into microphones about a grandmother found in pieces, a story too dark for this quiet town. Forensic teams in white coveralls continue to carry crates of evidence out of the brick house on the corner. Every item removed tells a story: a scorched grill grate, a box of heavy-duty gloves, and the saw. Neighbors stand on their porches in bathrobes, watching the blue lights flicker against their bedroom walls. One neighbor recalls Margaret as a woman who loved her garden, now a place marked by crime scene flags. The investigation turns to the motive, looking for the exact moment the family bond snapped. Financial records reveal that Margaret had recently threatened to cut Candace off from her inheritance. A final argument over a stolen checkbook is believed to be the catalyst for the fatal confrontation on Monday. The detective believes Candace snapped, and once the deed was done, she viewed her mother as a problem to be solved. Celia was caught in the wake of her mother's madness, a secondary player in a play of ultimate betrayal. The investigation reveals that the tension between Margaret and Candace had been simmering for decades. Detectives uncover a history of verbal abuse that had finally reached a deadly boiling point. It is June 3rd, and the formal charges are read to the mother and daughter behind glass partitions. Both women are charged with first-degree murder, a crime that carries the weight of life without parole. The community struggles to process the scale of the depravity that occurred in the house on the corner. How could a daughter, who had been a caregiver for years, turn into a cold-blooded executioner? Psychological experts suggest a phenomenon of caregiver burnout compounded by deep-seated resentment. They describe a mind that had detached from reality, viewing a human being as a mere obstacle. The chainsaw was not just a tool for disposal, but a symbol of the total destruction of the maternal bond. In the following weeks, the basement of the Craig residence is stripped bare by forensic specialists. They find blood spatter patterns on the joists that tell a story of a desperate struggle for survival. The evidence suggests that Margaret did not die instantly, fighting for her life in her final moments. This detail adds a new layer of cruelty to the already horrific charges facing Candace and Celia. A grand jury is convened to hear the testimony and review the grisly photographic evidence from the scene. The prosecution presents the Amazon receipt for the chainsaw, time-stamped just 48 hours after the murder. It is a chilling piece of premeditation that proves the cover-up was planned with calculated precision. Celia's defense team begins to paint her as a victim of her mother's psychological manipulation. They argue that a 19-year-old could not have stood up to the woman who controlled her entire world. But the prosecution points to the hours spent in the basement as evidence of active and willing participation. The public remains divided on whether Celia is a monster or a tragic figure caught in a web of evil. Meanwhile, the remains of Margaret Craig are finally released to her extended family for a proper burial. It is a small, private ceremony held under heavy gray clouds and a persistent, cold drizzle. There is no mention of the daughter or the granddaughter in the eulogy, only the woman Margaret once was. They remember a woman who loved her community and gave everything to a family that ultimately betrayed her. The house where the crime occurred is eventually boarded up, becoming a local landmark of tragedy. Weeds begin to choke the garden where Margaret once spent her peaceful Sunday afternoons. Neighbors often cross the street to avoid walking past the driveway where the police tape once hung. The trial date is set for the following spring, promising a long and painful journey through the legal system. As the sun sets on the town, the shadow of the brick house grows longer, stretching over the silent neighborhood. The mystery of why it happened is solved, but the horror of how it happened will never truly fade. The final psychiatric evaluations of Candace Craig reveal a person devoid of empathy or remorse. Experts testify that her behavior in the weeks following the crime was remarkably consistent with a sociopathic profile. She had continued to post on social media and interact with neighbors as if her mother were merely on a long vacation. This chilling ability to compartmentalize the horror in the basement is what most disturbed the lead investigators. Celia Hardy, however, began to show signs of a complete psychological breakdown while awaiting trial. Jail records indicate she spent hours staring at the walls of her cell, refusing to speak to anyone but her counsel. The prosecution eventually offers a plea deal to the granddaughter in exchange for her full testimony against Candace. They recognize that while she participated, the primary architect of the malice was undoubtedly her mother. In late 2024, the trial of Candace Craig finally begins in a courtroom filled to capacity. The prosecution opens with a simple but devastating line. A home is supposed to be a sanctuary, not a slaughterhouse. They display the chainsaw in a glass evidence case, its metal teeth a silent reminder of the brutality. Jurors are seen visibly recoiling as the forensic photos of the backyard grill are projected onto a large screen. The smell of smoke that the neighbors reported is described in court as the scent of a soul being erased. Candace sits at the defense table, her face a mask of indifference, refusing to look at the family members in the gallery. Her siblings testify about the years of tension and the coldness that had grown between the daughter and the mother. They describe Margaret as a woman who was increasingly afraid in her own home, yet too proud to leave. The most powerful moment comes when the recorded interrogation of Celia Hardy is played for the jury. Hearing the 19-year-old describe the sound of the saw creates a silence in the courtroom that is suffocating. The defense attempts to argue a moment of sudden passion, but the Amazon order for the saw proves otherwise. Planning a disposal before the death is even confirmed is the ultimate proof of first-degree murder. After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returns with a verdict that surprises no one in the room. Candace Craig is found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder and the unauthorized disposal of a body. She is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring she will never walk those streets again. Celia Hardy receives a reduced sentence for her cooperation, but the weight of her actions will follow her forever. She is sentenced to 20 years, a heavy price for a young woman who chose silence over the life of her grandmother. As she is led away in chains, she looks toward the gallery one last time, searching for a forgiveness that isn't there. The case of Margaret Craig remains a dark stain on the history of Maryland law enforcement. It serves as a grim reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who share our own blood. Today, the house has been sold and renovated, its new blue paint an attempt to wash away the memory of the past. A small memorial garden has been planted by the community in a nearby park, far away from that backyard. It is a place of peace, filled with the flowers that Margaret loved to grow when she was still whole. Visitors sit on the wooden bench and watch the birds, a stark contrast to the violence of her final hours. The investigators who worked the case say they still see the white bags in their dreams. They carry the weight of what they saw in that basement, a burden that comes with the pursuit of justice. Justice has been served in the eyes of the law, but for the family, the wound remains wide open. They are left to wonder how a bond as sacred as mother and child could turn into something so demonic. The story of Margaret Craig ends not with a saw, but with the memory of her kindness. We must remember the victim, not just the horrific way in which she was taken from this world. A grandmother, a sister, an aunt, and a pillar of a community that will never be the same. The screen fades to black as the names of those lost to domestic violence roll slowly upward. May her soul finally find the rest that was so cruelly stolen from her in the darkness of that Maryland basement, the shadow behind the smile. A lesson in compassion and vigilance. Margaret, Auntie Joyce Craig, was a beacon of love, a woman who spent her life providing for her family, even in her frailest years after multiple strokes. But behind the closed doors of a seemingly quiet neighborhood, a horror movie was unfolding not by a stranger, but by the very hands she once held. This tragedy isn't just a headline. It's a haunting reminder that the most dangerous shadows can hide within the sanctuary of home. It teaches us that caregiving is a sacred bond that must never be corrupted by greed or resentment. When we ignore the screams of the elderly or dismiss the smoke in a neighbor's yard, we risk losing the souls who nurtured us. True justice for Margaret means more than a life sentence. It means a commitment to vigilance and vocal love. We must protect our elders, for their vulnerability is not an invitation for cruelty, but a call for our deepest humanity. Don't just look, observe. Don't just hear, listen. Because once the fire burns out, all that remains is the chilling silence of what if. Let us choose compassion over darkness before the smoke rises again.